Hello, everyone. My name is Antonio Harden. I'm a child psychiatrist here at Stanford University. We welcome everyone who is joining us for this program or for this webinar as part of the overall program of Stanford Children Mental Health for Ukraine. I am excited today about the topic of the presentation, which is parenting strategies to address challenging behaviors in autism spectrum disorder by Dr. Karen Beers. I will introduce her later on, but before the introduction, I would like to do some housekeeping. As some of you are aware, we've been doing these webinars for the last several months, and you can go to our website to access the previously recorded lectures. In the next 2 months, we're going to be having some training on the child autism rating scales, but that will be given by Dr. Cheryl Kleiman, and these 2 sessions will be on October 5th and October 19th. In November, the first Wednesday of November, we will have Dr. Anya Atstuntseva, who will be talking about suicidality and parasuicidal behaviors in adolescents. And on December 7th, we will be hosting Dr. Lauren Moskowitz, who will be talking about treating fear and anxiety in youth with autism. So we look forward to all of these presentations. Some additional information that we'd like to remind people about for today's webinar, that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. We also will send you an evaluation at some point during the presentation, so you can provide some information or some feedback on how we're doing and suggestions for future sessions. Also, we have today 2 translations or 2 interpretations, one in Russian and one in Ukrainian. And I want to thank Irena and Dimitri for volunteering to do that. Part of our program include a toy drive for Ukraine. If people are interested in supporting us, please, you can go to our website and see how you can either donate toys or donate some monetary funds. Now, going back to our lecture today, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Karen Beers, who is joining us from Seattle Children's and from the University of Washington. Dr. Beers completed her training at the University of Florida, where she completed her bachelor degree, then her master's, then her PhD. Her work focuses on parenting interventions for children with autism spectrum disorder and co-occurring disruptive behavior. She's also been very active in disseminating and implementing evidence-based treatment into community mental health center. So we are excited to introduce her, and without further ado, I present you with Dr. Beers.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Okay. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to speak with you all. I'm hoping this will be a helpful and informative talk today. I'm going to be focusing on parenting strategies to address challenging behaviors in autism spectrum disorder. Today I have a couple of goals or objectives. The first is just to talk about the importance of parent training as a frontline treatment for autistic youth with challenging behaviors. I think it's fair to say that our parents are our strongest allies and supports when we're thinking about treatment for autistic children and youth. And so I'm going to highlight their role in broader intervention programming for these children. I'm also going to then talk about how we understand behaviors and challenging behaviors in autism. And an important part of that is trying to discover why a behavior is happening or occurring. And talk about how when you can discover why a behavior is happening, why a challenging behavior is happening, that opens the door to then figuring out what is going to be the most effective treatment for that behavior. And I'll end today by just going through some very specific strategies or treatments, approaches that can be used to address challenging behavior. So I hope part of this will be learning about behaviors and then ending with, again, some specific strategies. But I want to start with just talking about the role of parent training in the landscape of treatments for autistic youth. When we think about treatments, we oftentimes hear about applied behavior analysis, which is oftentimes, you know, a therapist working directly with the child around building new skills, communication, play, and certainly even addressing some of the challenging behaviors we're going to talk about today. You know, I have many colleagues that also understand and highlight the value of parents being involved in treatment. And there's a lot of reasons why this is a really important approach for care for autistic youth. The first is that we know parents can be successfully engaged in the treatment planning process and the treatment implementation process. And we have years and years of research and clinical work that supports this idea. In fact, when you look at parent training outside of autism, there's decades of research on demonstrating that we can teach parents to be the therapist for their child. What's beneficial about parent training is it tends to be a time-limited approach. And what I mean by that is it's typically a therapist working with a parent maybe 1, 2, 3 hours a week versus more traditional therapies where the therapist might work directly with the child for several hours a week. So parent training by design is typically a time-limited approach. That certainly means that we as therapists can support more families at once if we're talking about time-limited therapies. But again, I think the biggest value of parent training is at its core, it's emphasizing the role of the parent as the agent of change for their child. I sometimes tell parents, you know, I could work directly with your child. You could bring them to my office. I could work with them for, you know, an hour or two and have wonderful things happen in the therapy session, but then I'm going to send them home. And I'm more interested in what happens outside of my therapy office, the other, you know, 6 days and 23 hours that the child would not be with me. And the idea that I could instead teach the parent to become the therapist for their child. That means that child has the opportunity for therapy all day, every day. Again, we can have the parent become the agent of change for their child's behaviors and their skills. And so we have this setup that parent training can be a really important, in some respects, frontline approach to supporting autistic youth, that it doesn't have to just be the therapist in the community clinic that is driving the therapy for the child. I also think there's a lot of practical reasons why parents should be an important part of treatment and why we should be working directly with them. And I'm going to talk specifically about their role in relation to challenging behaviors and why I think including them in treatment is so important. And the starting place is that we know many children with autism experience challenging behaviors, whether it's tantrums or meltdowns, physical aggression, like hitting, biting, kicking. They sometimes have difficulty following instructions. They may engage in behaviors where they're hurting themselves, self-injurious behaviors. And that these rates of challenging behaviors can be, you know, average around 50% of children with autism. There's a bit of a range when you look at the numbers in the research, but we can say a good average is about 50% of children, autistic children, may also engage in these challenging behaviors. What I find really interesting is what we see in terms of a relationship between the presence of these challenging behaviors and the presence of adaptive skills deficits or daily living skills deficits. What I mean by adaptive skills deficits are the simple daily routine tasks that we want our children to engage in. So things like brushing their teeth or bathing or getting dressed in the morning or getting ready for school. That we oftentimes have children with autism that have difficulty engaging in these daily living skills or these daily routine activities. And we notice, and the data suggests that there's a link between the presence of challenging behaviors and the presence of these adaptive skills deficits. In practice, what this means is we hear parents say, my child knows how to brush his teeth, or he can wash his hands, but in practice, day to day, he's not doing that. And it's because when I have tried to get him to brush his teeth, I get hit, he runs out of the bathroom, he screams, and so I either just don't ask him to do it, or I just do it for him. And so when we have children who are not doing these skills or who require others to do them for them, that's what results in these adaptive skills deficits. Just to give a very concrete example, I worked with a family of a child who was in kindergarten, so around six years of age. And every morning, their routine in the morning was she would have her child on the sofa, the couch. She would put a tray in front of him. She would put his breakfast on the tray. She would turn the TV on, and then this mother would proceed to feed her child his breakfast, and she would dress him. She would get his shirt and his pants on, all while this child was watching cartoons on the TV. And this was a child that didn't have any significant motor skills deficits or cognitive deficits. So this is a child who would have been capable of feeding himself and dressing himself. But this mother, day in and day out, was the one that was doing it for him. And when we talked about this, she described, her history of trying to get him to do this himself, and it being met with the resistance, the crying, the hitting, the refusal. And so it was just easier for this mom to do these things for her child. It helped them get through the daily routine. This mom said, I can't be late to work again. I need to have my child ready for school. And so this is just how this family was operating in the morning routine to just help get through that morning. And so again, we see those challenging behaviors impacted that child's ability to engage in those skills of independence, those daily living skills independently. And so when we tie this all together, what we find with our families is that they are very stressed. They are experiencing very high levels of stress. We have a saying, a parent says, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. It's a statement of, I'm mindful of every step I take with my child, every ask I make, because I'm worried I'm going to say the wrong thing and we're going to end up with the meltdown, with the crying, with the aggression. And so they land in situations where they engage in a lot of accommodation. So that example of that mother feeding her child and dressing her child, that's an example of accommodating the child to try to prevent the child from having a meltdown over a particular demand or ask in the morning routine. So when we think about treating challenging behaviors, we actually are looking at changing a couple of things. We're trying to think about strategies that reduce those challenging behaviors, but if we can do that, that then opens the door to reintroduce that skill building, that skill acquisition. So it's kind of, as challenging behaviors go down, we can start working on improving those skills of independence. So, and these are all things that are happening in the daily routine with the family. Again, the morning routine, the, after school routine of, getting schoolwork done, meal times, getting ready for bed. These are when these challenging behaviors are occurring. And again, those are not things that are easy to replicate in my clinic. And so the idea that I'm helping parents learn strategies to be able to address these behaviors during their daily routine, that speaks to the power of parent training, the power of working with the families and helping them learn the skills to help their child be successful in the daily routine. So I'm going to, so hopefully I've made the case of why I think it's so important to support our families and our parents and help them learn strategies. I want to talk about how we approach teaching these skills to our parents. And so I'm going to start with just an overview of the behavioral principles that inform how we develop those intervention strategies. What I want to point out is that the strategies that I'm going to be talking about, they come from a program that I run, which is called the Ruby Parent Training Program. This is an outline of the program. It has 11 sessions that we teach parents from starting at the beginning with understanding why behaviors are occurring and understanding the antecedent behavior consequence model, to how we can prevent behaviors, how we can work on the daily schedule, how we can change how we respond to behavior through reinforcement, planned ignoring, etc., and then how we can teach new skills. And like I said, Ruby follows that model of we work on reducing challenging behaviors in the beginning of the program so that we can then start working on skill building towards the end of the program. We also have supplemental sessions because we know a lot of children with autism, as part of their behavioral challenge, they may have specific challenges around toileting skills, feeding issues, sleep issues, and we use all these behavioral strategies in the core sessions to address those very specific areas. And so the program has these supplemental sessions that we can bring in. Today, I'm going to be focusing on strategies that you might find in the beginning of the program, which is how we talk about, understanding why behaviors are occurring and some strategies around prevention, reinforcement, and I'm also going to talk about functional communication. But I just wanted you to know that the strategies and the principles that I'm introducing today are coming from a broader curriculum that I work with families on implementing. And I think there was discussion about possibly if there was interest in doing maybe a separate training to provide more detail on the Ruby program. But this is just a snapshot of what's involved. And as I mentioned, in the Ruby program, or when we're doing behavior strategy development, we're focusing on reducing the challenging behaviors like the difficulties following instructions, tantrums, aggressions, etc., and then improving or increasing those daily living skills or adaptive skills. So when we start a program like Ruby, or we start thinking about how to change behaviors, how to reduce these challenging behaviors, we have a couple of core principles that inform how we think about the behaviors. And the first principle that we think about is that we can understand the behaviors like hitting, screaming, throwing something, tearing or breaking items. We think of those behaviors as being learned. And what we just mean by that is that when a behavior occurs, it's because the environment has set up the likelihood for the behavior to happen in the first place. And then there's a response to the behavior that signals to the kid whether they should continue to do the behavior again or whether they should stop doing the behavior. And it's this relationship between what happens before a behavior and after a behavior that helps increase the likelihood that a behavior might be learned. And so I want to use a really specific example to illustrate this. For you parents out there, or for therapists that have worked a lot with children, we know toilet training can be a very important core skill that we want to teach our children. And when we think about toilet training, think about everything you did to set up the likelihood that the child will use the toilet, right? So it might be that you have a small toilet next to the big toilet, kind of a toddler toilet, or you have an insert that goes in the toilet. You might have a step stool so they could reach the sink to wash their hands. You might just watch the child and notice kind of some early body signals that they might be ready to use the bathroom. So we're mindful of setting the environment up for success for the child to engage in the behavior of using the toilet. And so at some point, we get to the child to the toilet, they successfully void in the toilet, and then think about what we do as caregivers or therapists. That first time the child voids in the toilet, what do? We cheer. We might give them a sticker or a little candy treat. We celebrate that successful toileting trip, right? So we are responding to the behavior in a way that signals to the child that what I just did must be pretty good. Maybe I should do it again, right? So if we just take the act of, a child learning how to use the toilet, we set the environment up for success to increase the likelihood that the behavior will happen. And then we respond in a way that helps the child learn that this is a good behavior, I should keep doing it. And that's kind of the circumstances that we think about in trying to understand how a behavior is being learned. I can use a similar example around, a child who is no longer brushing their teeth in the morning, for example. And we have the environment that might set up that learning, which is we're bringing to the child to the bathroom, we're handing the toothbrush, we're trying to put the toothbrush up to the child's mouth, right? So we are in a scenario where we're expecting the brushing teeth to happen. But when we do that, the child might push the toothbrush away or fall on the floor or try to run out of the bathroom. And we have some parents, for example, who might be like, this is just too difficult. So I'm not going to try to get them back in the bathroom. I'm not going to make them brush their teeth. And so they kind of let it go. They kind of give up on that child brushing their teeth in that moment. So in this situation, we have the environment setting up the attempt to have the child engage in the behavior. But the behavior that doesn't happen is brushing the teeth. The behavior that does happen is the tantrum. And the response is, when you tantrum, I will back off. And so we have this scenario where the child may learn, if I become upset, I get out of that task. And so the parent may be less likely to ask the child, but the child also may be more likely to tantrum anytime they're asked to brush their teeth in the future. So again, this is all trying to understand that when we're looking at a specific behavior, we want to understand what's going on around it to help understand why that behavior might have been learned. One of the most important things that I like to communicate to my families about behaviors is to understand that behaviors are a form of communication. When a child is hitting, they're trying to tell you something. When they run out of the room, they're trying to tell you something. When they scratch their own skin, they're trying to tell you something. And this is particularly important when we think about children, autistic children who may have communication difficulties. They can't use their words. They are even more reliant on their behaviors to communicate what they want and need. And so part of what I talk with parents about is when your child is engaging in a behavior, like screaming or throwing something, we can think, what is our child trying to tell us? What are they trying to communicate through that behavior? So just to kind of illustrate, we have a little girl here who looks very, very sad. She's closing her eyes, she's crying, she's kind of holding her hair. We can ask ourselves, what is she trying to tell us through these tears and holding her hair and the sadness that we see? And what we need to appreciate is that one behavior could mean very different things depending on circumstances. So if we were in a situation where there was a preferred treat out of reach, we could understand that crying in that moment was that child's way of saying, I want something that I can't reach, and I really, really want to have access to that. Or in a completely different situation, we could imagine that child is crying because they've been asked to do a really hard school task. So what this is illustrating is that the behavior alone doesn't necessarily tell us, or give the answer to what the child's communicating, but understanding the context of where the behavior is happening makes it easier for us to try to think about what is my child trying to communicate through this behavior. And that's at the core. That's how we start doing this work of trying to understand why that behavior is happening. And that leads to the next point, which is that we really think of behaviors as serving a function or a purpose. The goal of that behavior is to try to get a particular need or a particular want met. Again, that child crying because they see the little candy treat out of reach. Their crying is their way of saying, I want access to that candy, versus the child who's crying because they have a really difficult school assignment in front of them. Their crying in that moment might be saying, this is too hard, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I don't know what to do, or I really don't want to do this right now. So we want to understand when we see a behavior to say, what is my child trying to communicate through that behavior? And looking at the circumstances around to try to figure out that answer. When we think about what a purpose or a function of a behavior is, there's four kind of main categories that we think about. One of them is a child might be engaging in a behavior as their way to communicate, I want to get out of this, I don't want to do this, this feels too hard. And so we think about it kind of an escape or getting away from something that might be really unpleasant. Maybe it's a certain task, maybe it's a certain person, a certain place, but their behavior is trying to communicate, I don't want to do this, I want to get away from this, I want to get out of this. It may instead be communicating, I want that thing. I see something that I want that I can't access, but I want to access it. Or I have something that I really, really like, and you're trying to take it away from me. And my behavior is a way of saying, I want to keep this. A really, really common example is when children are playing on maybe a tablet or a screen or a phone, and the parent tries to take it away, and the child starts screaming and turning and hiding, and that's their way of saying, no, I want to keep this. I want to maintain access to my tablet. And so their behavior is a way of communicating, I want access to this really preferred item, toy, food, etc. The third is, it may just be about, I need your attention. That the core of the behavior is, I need you paying attention to me. And we can see these behaviors when, a child does something funny that they want their peers to laugh at. They're trying to get their peers' attention. Or maybe a caregiver is really busy. I commonly hear parents say, I'm trying to get dinner ready, and my child is like, at my feet, holding onto my leg, literally, because they want my attention. So sometimes we think, I'm doing this behavior as a way to get your attention. Lastly, we need to think about, for autistic children, sometimes the behavior is what we call an automatic function. And what that simply means is they're engaging in that behavior not because it gets them access to something in their environment or to a person or to get out of something in their environment. They're doing it because it impacts how they feel inside. You might think of this as a sensory behavior, a self-stimulatory behavior. But the point of it is that when they engage in that behavior, it's impacting how they feel inside. It might create a really pleasant sensation inside, a pleasant sensory sensation. Or it might be something that when they engage in that behavior, it reduces an unpleasant sensation or state. I like to use like hand flapping and body rocking as an example. And we have some children that do this. They'll flap their hands and they'll rock their body. And it's a calm time, a neutral time. They're just doing that because it creates a very pleasant sensation. I had one child that would press on his eyes, and the hypothesis is that sometimes when you press on your eyes, you sometimes get a little bit of a stars or there's a visual sensation when you press on your eyes. And so that he was doing that because he liked the kind of sensory or the visual feedback that he was getting. We have other kids that might flap their hands and rock their bodies because they're feeling very overwhelmed, and this is a way of calming their body. We talk about children who like to go on swings. as a way to self-regulate their body. So again, the whole idea around this automatic function is that they're doing a behavior because it feels good to them, or it's reducing an unpleasant sensation internally. So again, when we see a behavior, we want to understand what is the child trying to communicate through that behavior. We can try to understand that by thinking about what's going on around the behavior, the context, and try to see if we can say they're trying to communicate something in line with, I want to get out of something, I want to get access to something, I want attention, or I'm doing this because it's an automatic sensory behavior. The way, I mentioned we want to understand context. We want to understand what's going on around the behavior. The model we use to kind of concretely work that out is using what's called the ABC model, or although I'm realizing it might not be ABC in Russian or Ukrainian, but in English it's ABC because we're talking about antecedent, behavior, consequence. What we're really looking at is when we have the behavior, which is the green box, we want to understand what happened right before that behavior and what happened right after that behavior to do this work of understanding context, understanding what's going on around the behavior to start answering that question of why is this behavior occurring. When we're talking about antecedents, we're saying it's the trigger or the cue that sets the behavior off. This behavior doesn't happen unless there is that trigger or cue. So the child doesn't start screaming about brushing teeth until the parent says, go in the bathroom to brush your teeth. That's the antecedent to the screaming and the tantrum. I have a plate of vegetables. I have lots of children with autism that don't like vegetables. And so it might be they're perfectly fine at the meal until you put a scoop of vegetables on their plate, and then we get the plate is thrown or the child leaves the table, right? The thing that set off those behaviors was the presentation of the vegetables. We all live under these rules of the antecedent behavior consequence. When our phone rings, what do? We pick it up and we answer it, right? So the phone ringing is the antecedent to the behavior of us answering the phone. Sometimes we say decline. So these are just some examples of common antecedents or triggers or cues for challenging behaviors in autism. It could be a demand, like go sit down, go get dressed, come to the table, put your tablet away. It could be a restriction, which is, no, you can't have that right now. Or similarly, taking away a preferred toy or food. We also have to appreciate that for children with autism, it could be the onset of a negative sensory stimuli. So entering a room that's very crowded, or all of a sudden hearing a really loud noise. That could trigger, covering ears and body rocking, right? So we just really, again, are thinking about anything that triggers, that sets off a challenging behavior. One thing I want to also kind of appreciate around antecedents is sometimes it's a really specific thing that happens. I put the vegetables down. I tell him to go start his schoolwork. I ask him to brush his teeth. So those are really clear, specific antecedents or triggers or cues. But for autistic children, there also are what we call setting events, which can play into whether a challenging behavior occurs. And I think of setting events as not one very specific, quick onset, but more just kind of some things that are going on with the child or in the environment that increase the likelihood that they might be set off by a particular trigger, antecedent, or cue. So for example, sensory issues are a really good example. A child who is in an environment that just has a lot of noise, it's very unpredictable, that kind of might increase their feeling of being overwhelmed or overstimulated or feeling anxious. And then someone comes along and the parent says, oh, please hold my hand. And that one demand is enough to kind of set them into challenging behavior because they're already feeling overwhelmed and overloaded. And that one simple demand kind of pushes them over the edge to be engaging in a challenging behavior. We can also think about children, autistic children, and the rigidities that oftentimes come with autism, and that is where I try to help parents understand there are sometimes behaviors that we see, challenging behaviors that we see, that are more about I cannot do this right now versus I could, but I just don't want to. And so an example might be a child who is putting together a toy set. Maybe they're building a train set or a Lego blocks, and they need to finish the train track. They need to finish those last few pieces on the Lego blocks. And the parent comes over and says, "Okay, come on, let's get ready for dinner. Let's go to the dinner table." And the child just absolutely melts down. They cry, they scream, they say no. And in that moment, it may not be what we might call defiance or noncompliance, where like they could, they just don't want to. It could instead be that child really has difficulty transitioning. They really have difficulty stopping something, especially if it's not finished, or they feel like they need to finish a part before they can transition. And so we say a behavior might come not because they don't want to do something, but they literally cannot do something in that moment. So we want to kind of understand all of these elements that might explain why we are seeing a challenging behavior in the moment. And I think it's interesting to think that commonly challenging behaviors are more about sensory issues, anxiety, rigidities, overstimulation, than it is, I just don't feel like doing something. And I think that's an important thing to understand with a lot of autistic children. They're not doing things just to be difficult. Something is making it really difficult for them to be able to engage in a task or a skill, and their behavior is their way of communicating, this is too much, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I can't do this right now, etc. Okay, so we're talking about the antecedent behavior consequence model. We just talked about kind of what sets off behaviors, those antecedents and setting events. The B in the model is just the behavior. It's what the person does. We like to, when we're talking about behaviors with a parent, to use really clear descriptions of the behavior. I might say, tell me what you see your child doing when they're upset. And so we're trying to get parents to move away from saying, oh, he was really overwhelmed, and instead say, he screamed, he fell on the floor, he threw a toy, and then ran out of the room. And so we say a really good description of a behavior is one where you could measure that behavior in terms of like how long it lasted or how many times it happened. And just to give some examples, in these, on this slide, we have on the top row kind of less clear descriptions about the behavior versus underneath we have more clear descriptions of the behavior. So for example, on the first picture it says the child gets upset when taken to the bathroom. Well, what does upset mean? What does that really look like? Versus the person saying, oh, he hits, cries, and flops on the floor when I try to take him to the bathroom. So we're using much more clear behavior descriptions of what that looks like. Or the next one, doesn't sleep well at night. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Oh, it really means he wakes up 2 to 3 times per night and cries out for me. So anyway, you get the idea that when we're talking about behaviors, we want to try to be as clear as possible in our description. And then the last part of our ABC model is the consequence. That's just what comes after the behavior. And I think sometimes parents think about consequences as punishment, or sometimes reward, but we're really just talking about what follows the behavior. We would say all behaviors have a consequence. Anytime you do something, something happens after it. And only in certain circumstances may it actually be a reinforcer or punishment. A reinforcer is something that increases the likelihood of behavior will happen again. A punishment is something that decreases the likelihood the behavior will happen again. And again, consequences can be planned or unplanned. Planned just means you set up in advance. If you, stay at the table for 5 minutes, then you'll get to watch 5 minutes of your tablet. That would be a planned consequence for staying at the table. Versus a lot of times families operate in unplanned consequence circumstances where a behavior happens and they just in that moment pull out a response to that behavior. You know, what we really try to work on in our program is how we can help parents really do their best to be as having as many planned consequences as possible, because what that does is it helps make things predictable for the child. They know what to expect, they know what's coming, which is really, really important for autistic children. So I'm gonna try this out. I actually have a video that I'm gonna show, and I will just have you all watch the video. And if you had a piece of paper or just kind of think about when you're watching the video, look for, you know, certainly what the behaviors are, what behaviors do you see, but also look at what sets the behavior off, what is the antecedent or trigger, and then what follows the behavior, what happens after the behavior. And we can use this information to understand why the behavior is happening. We also might think about what setting events are in play, what kind of might have made it more likely that we see these challenging behaviors. And we can ask ourselves, what is the child learning in this situation? So let's go ahead and give this a try.
Can I have a brownie?
Oh, not right now, honey. All right, it's lunchtime.
But why?
Because it's lunchtime. It's not time for brownies.
Open it.
I said it's not time for brownies.
Open it. Open it.
All right, you can have one brownie. That's it now.
Very happy little kid. And I realize I probably should have given a little more context there, where what we had was the parent, we can talk about it in the ABC model. So the behaviors that we saw were he kind of shoved the brownies, he stomped his feet, he's yelling. And what we might say the antecedent is he came over and asked for a brownie, and he was fine until mom said, oh, nope, not right now. So we would say mom saying no to the brownies is what set off, which triggered, which was the cue for the stomping, the throwing the brownies, the yelling. The consequence was mom gave the brownie. She opened up the box and gave him a brownie. And so we could think to ourselves, what did this child learn in this situation? We might suggest that he learned that if he stomps his feet and yells, mom is going to give him what he wants. Right? He's learning, that's how he's getting access to the brownie. So that would be the function. If we thought about, you know, setting events, we might say, well, maybe he was hungry. Maybe he was bored. Mom was busy doing some reading and he didn't have anything to keep himself busy. And so he maybe was a little bored and then came across the snack and asked mom for it. So that's just an example of how we can think about when a behavior happens. In this case, it was the stomping, the yelling, and pushing the brownies, and think about context. What's happening before the behavior and what's happening after the behavior? What made the behavior more likely to happen, and what was the response to the behavior that helped mom think that helped the child think that maybe this stomping and yelling is going to work for me to get access to what I want, which was the function. I want to just tie this all together when we think about, you know, functions of behavior and why it's so important. And here we have an example of two kids in the classroom that are given a math assignment to work on. And we have both of them turn them into paper airplanes, which just means they kind of fold up their papers. They start talking to their, you know, who's sitting next to them in the class. They make loud noises, and so they're being disruptive in the classroom. And we have, in this example, the teacher sends them out of the classroom. Too much noise, you know, they're disrupting the other children, so leave the classroom. This is an example where the choice of the teacher to send them out of the classroom makes a lot of sense, but it actually may not be the most effective consequence, because what we learn about kid number one is his behavior, the function of his behavior is to get out of things. He does not like doing the math work. It's very difficult for him. He does not want to do it. And then so in this situation, his disruptive behavior is actually working really, really well for him to get out of that math work that he doesn't want to do in the first place. And so we have a teacher that has chosen the consequence of him having to leave the classroom, which again makes a lot of sense because he's being disruptive, but it also just happens to reinforce the behavior. And so what we might expect is the next time the child's given the math work, he's going to do the same thing because he's learning that's how I get out of doing that math work. You have the other child who engaged in the exact same behaviors, may love being, we call the class clown. He likes it, everyone's looking at him, that he's the center of attention. So his behaviors are more about getting attention. If you send that child out of the classroom, you might actually have a really good consequence because you're kind of disconnecting him or separating him from what he's after, which is to get his peers' attention. This example, I bring this up because it demonstrates that the answer to a strategy doesn't lie in the behavior itself, right? Because the behaviors are the same here. The answer to the strategies lies in the function, why the behavior is happening. So kid number one, who we know wants to get out of the assignment, we're going to change what we do. We're going to maybe make sure the teacher stays closer to him during the math work to help support him. Or maybe we don't give him the whole worksheet. We only give him one problem at a time. Or maybe we instead set up a reinforcement system where every time he does a problem, he gets a check. And when he gets 3 checks, he earns access to a preferred activity. But what we're not going to do is send him out of the classroom or let him get out of the math work, right? So we are creating a treatment plan that's responsive to the function of the behavior. Kid number 2, who likes his peers' attention, we might say to him, oh, how about this? As soon as you finish your math sheet, you can get in front of the class and tell some jokes to the class. So you can become the class clown, but you can do it for finishing your work instead of in the middle of when we're supposed to be doing the work. So that's a very different treatment plan from the first child. Again, they're both engaging in the same behavior, but the reason for the behavior is very different. So we think it's important to do this detective work to figure out why the behavior is happening in order to then think about what we could do differently in terms of strategies. So I'm going to give some now examples. So let's say we know why a child is engaging in behaviors. It's because they're trying to get out of a hard math assignment, or it's because they want access to, the food that they shouldn't be getting into. So we can start, if we understand why the behavior is happening and we understand what sets the behavior off or what the antecedent is, we can start thinking about strategies to change either the trigger, the cue, the antecedent, or change how we respond to the behavior. So I'm going to talk about first ways that we can change the antecedent, and we call these prevention strategies. And so the real goal with a prevention strategy is if we can identify what sets the behavior off, there's an opportunity to then eliminate or minimize that trigger, that antecedent to the behavior. So one of my favorite strategies is what we call doing things in small doses. That we understand a trigger or a cue to a behavior is when a child is given a task or a demand that feels too big, that feels too hard, or they're asked to do something that is taking too long. And so are there ways that we can change the ask, make the task smaller, or make the task not as long in duration? So a classic example is, a child who is given a schoolwork assignment or a homework assignment, and they're just said, here's the worksheet, you work on this worksheet. And they see the worksheet and there's 10 problems and it's hard for them. Again, maybe the answer is to not give them something that's going to make them feel overwhelmed, and instead give them a smaller task. So again, let's just work on one problem before and maybe get a reward for that one problem, and then we'll work on the next problem and a reward. So we're breaking down the size of the task or the demand. Or commonly I have parents say, when I ask my child to clean up after dinner, go clean up your dishes. Or they'll say, please pick up your room. or go get ready for school. Those are really, really big commands. They're big asks. Cleaning up after dinner means put your, put the dish in the sink, put your silverware and cup in the sink, wipe your table, put your trash in the garbage. Those are lots of things that need to happen in the name of cleaning up after dinner. And so instead we have the parent, let's just focus on having your child put his dish in the sink. Or, for cleaning up their room. Let's not say pick up your room. Let's say, please put your book back on the shelf. We're really narrowing what the ask is to reduce the likelihood the child feels overwhelmed and to help them feel more successful. And then similarly, again, for tasks that might feel too long for the child, are there ways we can kind of make it a smaller ask? So if there's a family gathering that normally is for the, all day, maybe we go take our child there for the first, 2 hours or the last 2 hours. If we know every single time we take the child for the whole event, they become very dysregulated because it's overwhelming. There's a lot of people and noise, et cetera. Or maybe instead of saying, brush your teeth, which means, get your toothbrush, get it ready, brush your teeth, clean up, we instead do most of it for them and then say, let's just brush your front teeth for 5 seconds and set a timer for that. Or instead of sitting at the table for 20 minutes, it's okay to sit there for 5 minutes. Now with small doses, that doesn't mean that, whatever we start with is where we end. We just think of small doses as the entry point. So right now we're just gonna work on one math problem. And once the child's successful doing one math problem, then we'll start working on 2 math problems. And then we'll work on 3 math problems. But the point is that you start small and build up versus starting big with the likelihood that they're gonna end up fighting or protesting, a task that feels too big. So doing things in small doses. Another strategy, this is a really common one, it's just changing the order of events. It's acknowledging that sometimes, especially with transitions, the trigger to behavior is when a child is asked to stop something fun to do something that they don't want to do. So come inside from playing so you can do your homework. Turn off the tablet because it's time for dinner. And so we look for opportunities to change the order, which is first you do your homework and then you can go outside and play. First get dressed and then in the morning and then you can watch your cartoons. First get your schoolwork done, then you can play on your tablet. And we see that there's more success when the child knows what fun activity is waiting for them once they complete the less preferred activity. Another one is what we call changing how you ask. And this just acknowledges that sometimes the way we approach instructions can create challenging behavior. So a common example is when a kid hears, no, you can't do that. Can I have a cookie? No, you can't have a cookie. Can I play on my tablet? No, you can't play on your tablet. And just hearing that word no is the trigger to some challenging behaviors. It also can be if the way you ask feels abrupt or unexpected. So let's say it's time for dinner and the child's playing with their toys, and the parent just walks in the room and says, okay, go eat, let's go get dinner. That demand might feel unexpected or unpredictable, and again, might elicit a challenging behavior. So the question is, can we change how we ask children to do things that either makes them more predictable or might actually help increase their feeling of autonomy or agency? So, instead of saying, no, you can't have a cookie, like a child says, I'm hungry, can I have a cookie? Instead of saying, no, you can't have a cookie, you say, would you like an apple or some bread? And so you're not saying no, you're just giving alternatives in place. And then, of course, a really common one is providing warning. So instead of just abruptly saying it's time for dinner, you might say, okay, in 10 minutes it's time for dinner. In 5 minutes it's time for dinner. So the child knows the transition is coming. And even better is when we use a visual to support that, like a timer. So we're going to watch a video that shows a morning routine that does not go very well, and we can think about the prevention strategies that we just talked about and how they might be helpful. So what we're going to see is a parent trying to get their child ready for the morning routine. She's going to come downstairs, try to get him to get his coat on to leave the house, and let's see what happens in that situation.
Come on, buddy. Got some errands to run. Come on, let's get your shoes and your coat on. Come on. Come on, let's go. Hey, 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 come on. Listen to me. We got to get going. Mommy's running late. Stop that, all right? Look, if I help you put your shoes on, will you put your coat on? Come on. Come on. Mommy will help you put your shoes on. Hey, come on. Hey, I got to go. I don't have time for this now. Sit up now. Sit up now. Come on. Come on. Come on. You get your coat on, all right?
All right. So that did not go very well. The parent comes downstairs. The child's sitting there on the couch watching TV. The parent comes down and says, time to go. Let's get your coat on. And what we see happen is there's this struggle. Mom's trying to get the coat and shoes on. The kid's turning away. He's nestling in the couch. And she's not very successful with getting the coat on. And so we could use, do things in small doses, because mom comes in and is like, get your coat and shoes on. Instead, she might say, please put this shoe on. So she might break the command down into smaller doses, if you will. Or maybe she changes the order of events. What we see is he's watching cartoons. So maybe first, she knows she has to change the routine so that first he gets his shoes and his coat on, and then he can watch his cartoon. Or maybe she could change how she asks. She could say, do you want to put your coat on first, or do you want to put your shoes on first? Or I think probably really importantly, she could give warning. So she just kind of comes down the stairs and tries to start that routine. Instead, maybe she could have come down in 10 minutes and said, in 10 minutes, it will be time to get your coat and shoes on. And maybe she sets a timer and then comes down 5 minutes later and says, in 5 minutes, it will be time to put your coat and shoes on. So she's giving that advance warning. So any of those prevention strategies could have been helpful to address what otherwise was a really difficult routine in terms of getting the child ready for the morning routine. So other examples of prevention strategies, ways we can set our child up for success, a really, really big one is visual support. What we know for many children with autism is they do much better if they could see what is expected of them versus just being told what to expect. And this can even be the difference, I mentioned timers, the difference between telling the child in 5 minutes we're going to transition versus showing the child on a timer a countdown of 5 minutes. A really classic, I mentioned changing the order of events. A really classic visual is a first then board. So first we're going to do our work, like your worksheet, and then you get computer time. Or here's an example of a leisure schedule or a free time schedule, which is when a child has downtime, it can be hard for them to think about what they might do during that time. And so this little visual shows them what their choices are. You could go out and play basketball, you could play with your blocks, you could, do Play-Doh, etc. So instead of the parent having to list off a bunch of ideas, they have a visual that shows them. Here are just some other examples. I had a child who often would run out of the house or without the parent knowing. And so we made this sign that says, stop, please ask before going outside. And they just put this on every exit of their house. And that was a visual prompt for the child to stop and to know that they needed to go to an adult to ask permission before they went outside. Or a child who, might have a hard time answering the question, what do you want for your snack? Because that's kind of an open-ended question that they then have to respond to verbally, that you might instead show pictures. Oh, here's your snack choices, what do you want? And they could just point to the picture or say, crackers. Another version of visual supports are daily schedules. These are ways that we outline visually what the daily routine is going to look like. And the beauty of daily schedules is they clarify what the routine is going to be and what transitions are coming up. And ideally, you can show on a visual schedule, these are the things that we need to do, but then we can transition to your preferred activity. They would see that on their schedule. And what's nice about visual schedules is you can have them for just a small portion of the day, like the morning routine or the evening routine. You might have it for the entire daily routine, or it could even be for a very specific routine. So you might have a visual schedule that shows the steps of brushing teeth. Go get your toothbrush and toothpaste, open your toothpaste, put the toothpaste on the toothbrush, etc. So we can think about a visual schedule being any part of a routine or part of the day or even a whole day. And these are just some examples. Here's a child, they have to wake up, have their breakfast, brush teeth, brush their hair, get their clothes, get in the car, meet their teacher, and have school, and then they'll be done, say goodbye for the day. Or here's, so any way we can think about creating a visual representation of what otherwise might be verbal instructions. If we can turn it into a visual, that can be really helpful. So those are all ways we can prevent behaviors, and we can think about what sets off a behavior, the trigger, and how we can change how we respond. We can also change our consequences. And I want to talk about reinforcement specifically because I think it's one of the most common types of consequences that we hear about, but oftentimes there's ways that they don't go very well. Some parents will say, my child doesn't find anything reinforcing, they don't want to work for anything, they don't like anything. And so we have to understand what we really mean by reinforcement. And so the first place is to understand there's a difference between what we call a preference versus a reinforcer. A preference is something the child likes, would be happy to take, versus a reinforcer is something the child likes so much they're willing to work for it. And so we need to distinguish between I like it versus I like it enough to work for it. One of the biggest things when we look about reinforcement and why it goes wrong is because sometimes what we're asking the child to do to earn a reinforcer is too big. So we have to make sure that the behavior we're targeting in the beginning is reasonable. Again, it's the difference between saying you earn a reinforcer for doing one math problem versus you earn a reinforcer for doing your entire worksheet. If the child has never done an entire worksheet, it's not going to matter what you offer for a reinforcer. It's always going to feel too big. I think the ultimate part of reinforcement is what I think about, which is the relationship between the behavior you want to change and the reinforcer you're offering. And I say it's kind of like a formula where the child has to have the experience that what I'm being asked to do doesn't feel too big, and what you're offering sounds pretty cool, and so I'll do it. Anytime that formula is out of whack or not in alignment is when we don't have behavior change. And what I mean by that is when the child feels the behavior is too big or the reinforcer doesn't feel big enough, we're not going to have behavior change. I use the example of, I like chocolate cake. I have a picture of a chocolate cake there. If someone just came to my house and said, here's some chocolate cake, I would be like, thank you, that is delicious. If someone said to me, Karen, if you clean your entire house, I will give you a piece of chocolate cake, I wouldn't do it because I don't like chocolate cake that much, and that sounds like a really, really big job, and so it's just not worth it. So I wouldn't do it. But if someone said, hey, Karen, if you do your dishes, then I'll give you a piece of chocolate cake, I might actually do that because doing my dishes, that doesn't feel too hard, and I like chocolate cake enough, right? So it's the relationship of how big the behavior asks or how small it is in relation to what you're offering as a reinforcer that influences whether the reinforcer will actually work. And of course, the last consideration is if I was at work today and there were 3 birthday parties and everyone brought chocolate cake and I already had 4 pieces of chocolate cake at work, if I then came home and someone said, if you do the dishes, I'll give you chocolate cake, in that moment, I wouldn't do it because I already had chocolate cake. I don't want more chocolate cake, right? So it's never as simple as just, oh, do this and earn that. It really is this, understanding, what we're asking the child to do in relation to what we're offering as a reinforcer. We also can understand that for children with autism, they might have unusual or unique reinforcers. So I had a child that loved to flush toilets. And so he would do his work in order to earn opportunities to flush the toilet. So very unique reinforcer, but for that child, that's what they were willing and motivated to work for. I do like to focus on what I call natural reinforcers or privileges. So I don't like to talk with families about having to go to the store and buy something or do things that cost a lot of money. There's so many things that are part of a child's natural routines that can be turned into reinforcers, like extra playtime with mom or dad, doing a board game together, or getting to go to the park that's next door, or getting that tablet time. The family already has a tablet or cartoon, a TV, or getting an extra story at bedtime. We can take advantage of things that are already part of the family's routine and just use them wisely as reinforcers. Lastly, we talk about reinforcement versus bribery. And what, parents will often say, I don't want to give my child something because that's bribing them. And what we are more mindful of is that bribery for us means we've asked the child to do something, they said no, and then we follow up with offering a reinforcer. So this cartoon that we have here, it says, clean your room, and the person says, no, thank you. And then the other person responds with, well, I'll give you candy. And then they say, okay, fine, I'll do it, right? So the initial command was refused, and they weren't willing to do it until they were offered a reinforcer. And what we would say is you change this by saying up front, okay, I need you to clean your room, and if you clean your room, you'll get, you can have a candy treat. Like, we're setting up the reinforcer in advance instead of in response to a refusal. That's where we talk about kind of moving into, bribery territory. The last skill that I want to talk about is functional communication training. This goes back to the idea we've already talked about, that behavior is a form of communication. When a child is screaming, crying, running out of the room, hitting, they're trying to tell us something. So the question is if we can understand what the child is trying to communicate through that inappropriate behavior or inappropriate communication, can we teach them to use a different way to communicate what they need? So I've had children where screaming is their way to get people to leave them alone. And we know that the screaming serves that function or purpose. When I scream, people leave me alone. We could teach that child instead a more appropriate way to say, leave me alone. It could be, holding their hand out. It could be holding up a card that says, I need space. It could be using the words, space, please. All of those behaviors serve the same function as the screaming, which is communicating I need space, but they're way more appropriate than the screaming. And so we can teach parents, if that's what we want to teach the child to do, we're going to ignore the scream. We're not going to leave when they scream. But the moment they hold up their hand or the moment they hold up that card that says space, we're going to say, oh, you want space? Okay, I'm going to leave. And so you reinforce their use of that more appropriate tool, communication tool, that again serves the same exact function, but is just way more appropriate. Another classic example is asking for a break. Let's say the child normally during school, when they become really frustrated with the task that they don't want to do, they rip their paper up, they throw their chair, they leave their desk, and that's their way of communicating, this is too hard, I don't want to do this right now. And we could actually help them learn a better way to communicate, I need a break. And again, it could be a card on their desk that says break. It could be raising their hand. It could be saying break, please. And what we help them learn is that if they just touch the card or raise their hand or say break, we'll actually let them escape from the task. We'll give them that break when they use that more functional communication tool. So ultimately, functional communication is about understanding the function or reason for an inappropriate behavior and teaching the child instead a new, more appropriate way to communicate their needs so they don't have to use that inappropriate behavior anymore. So to kind of bring everything together with what we've talked about, when I'm doing strategy development with families and thinking about how to come up with new behavior strategy ideas to target challenging behaviors, ultimately what I'm trying to help the parent do is walk through this process, which is first and foremost, I want to make sure we know what behavior we're talking about. We're being very clear in how we describe the behavior. And before I ever get into problem solving, we're going to talk about why is this behavior happening? What is this child trying to communicate through their behavior? What is the function of that behavior? And that information comes from that ABC data that we collect. Thinking about context, learning about what's setting the behavior off, learning about how the response to the behavior might be reinforcing it. And only once I've clearly defined the behavior and the function, then I can go into thinking about, can I prevent this behavior from happening in the first place? Can I use those prevention or antecedent management strategies? Can I change how I respond to it? Right now I'm doing, I'm giving in when he screams. Do I need to change how I respond so that doesn't reinforce that screaming? Can I teach a new skill in place of that behavior? When we think about this work, some last food for thought is to appreciate that when we implement a new strategy, the child's having to learn something new all over again. And so it's not like you do something once and expect the behavior to change overnight. There's a relearning process or a new learning that's happening. This can take time. And sometimes when our child gets upset about that new strategy, that's just their way of saying, I don't like this. But it might actually be a signal that the strategy is working. I do think it's important for parents to really focus on one strategy at a time. Give it a week or two to really practice before you add a new strategy. And really the key to all of this change is just really focusing on implementation that highlights being consistent in your strategies, creating predictability in your strategies, and following through, really helping the child understand that this is how we're going to support you or change how we respond. And so with that, I'm going to stop. I see there's lots of things in the chat and the Q&A, and hopefully we have some time to go through some of those. So thank you so much for this opportunity and for your time. I just am so appreciative of this, and thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this very informative lecture. And as you were going through these examples, a lot of situations that I hear from patients when they ask me about how to deal with this and that. So I'm glad that you're able to cover some of the common things that we deal with on a regular basis. So we have several questions. So we'll start with the first one. So it's translated from Russian. So my kid is addicted to watching YouTube videos. So, and I say my kids, as people know, we try to avoid answering questions that are related to specific kids, but this is a very common scenario.
Yeah.
When it's almost all kids these days are addicted to the screen, and they are usually overexcited. The parents are aware of it. Some of us are aware of it, but we don't want to deal with the consequences with the tantrums. Yeah. And we let it go. Any thoughts on how to deal with screen addiction?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually going to do an entire talk on that with some colleagues in Quebec, because this is such a common issue for kids. And first is kind of understanding, for any one particular child, what's contributing to it. For some, it's it's the transition off of the screens is what's hard. For other kids, I have kids that we call them, they're sneakers. The parents put the screens away and they're really good at finding, where they're hidden. And Antonio, you mentioned that sometimes it's just a matter of just anytime I ask them to get off, I get, the screaming, the meltdown. And so, I always ask myself, are there ways I can prevent the problem from happening in the first place? One of the common strategies are what we call controlling the environment. This is where we look for, are there ways for as a parent to have more control over when the child does and does not have access to the screens? So this could be things like the passwords. I have parents that literally turn off the internet in their home. Sometimes you have to get a little strategic and kind of bigger strategies for these. I have families that have lock boxes. I know that sounds another radical choice, but it's the idea that if it's physically put away, the child can't access unless the parent, can control when they do or don't have access. So this, again, the first piece is, can the parent create opportunities to just have more control over when the child has the screens. The next is thinking about when the child has screens in the daily routine, right? So a common thing I hear is that the kid wakes up and the first thing they do is get on screens in the morning. And then now I have to get them off to be able to get through the morning routine. Or as soon as they come home from school, they get on the screens. And then I have to get them off to do the homework and the dinner, et cetera. And so there's this combination of, if there's ways to have more control over when screens are accessed, and then using that kind of changing the order of events. So we have families that work on, parent holds access to the screen. The child has a visual that shows them they have to wake up, get dressed, eat their breakfast, and then they can have screens. So it's showing them that they totally can have it, but some things need to happen before that access occurs. Again, that requires the parent to have some control over the screens in order for them to be able to align that. But our kids can learn, I'll get it, I just have to do some things before I can get there. And then lastly, it's thinking about using screens as reinforcers. So, again, this idea that we can give access, but how much screen time occurs or when they get it is in relation to whether other tasks or activities are completed first. One of my favorite strategies that kids seem to really respond to is the quicker you get done with X, the more screen time you'll have after, right? So the more in the morning routine is the classic. The kid who dawdles, delays, doesn't want to, and then they know that they'll get screens at some point, no matter how long they take. And instead changing it up to say, the quicker you get done with your morning routine, the more time you'll get with your screens. So those are some very simple, and I'm sure there's lots of, your minds are probably thinking, but what about this and what about this? But I will say at its core, this idea of being able to have some control over, and it can be the password. Some screens, they can actually shut off themselves. You set a timer and the device turns down. A lot of times that's key to being able to do some of these modifications around then when they have access or how much they have access to it. But very, very common challenge and not an easy one to address, I acknowledge.
Very good. Thank you. Just 3 quick thoughts about that. So I installed this time down app for my kids and they deleted it. They find a way to delete it. So that's one.
Yes.
The second is what works for like preschool, not preschoolers, like elementary school kids might not work for teenagers. And the third and most important thing is it's going to take an active involvement of the parents and the professionals working with them. It's not easy. I think they put our ingenuity and our creativity to test when kids trying to outsmart us with the screen time. Very good. Yeah. Thank you. So next question. And that's a common question. That's why I think we have several questions. I'm picking the one that are usually commonly seen in clinical practice. So a kid who's already potty trained and the parents know that he or she or they are potty trained, they start witnessing some accidents when they are, doing a favorable activity like watching a cartoon or playing in a sandbox. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. I actually have a family I'm working with right now that's the case. She's actually a 9-year-old girl who is otherwise toilet trained, but she knows how to use the toilet, but is having accidents. And it's because of that, she's too into what she's doing right now to stop. And she also has some difficulties with recognizing just body signals that she has to go. And this is, again, where, first of all, when we're talking about toilet training, we often like to know what the child's natural voiding habits are, whether it's an accident or not. Like, when does this child typically void in terms of urination or bowel movements? When are the highest risk times for accidents? And then trying to, again, I'm a really, really big fan of prevention. How can we get ahead of it? And if we know, for example, it's the accident happens from when they get home from school to dinner, because that's when there's downtime, they're most likely to be engaging in preferred activities, that I'm creating some structure for that child that shows, come home, put your backpack away, use the toilet, and then you can go outside and play. And I might even add a reinforcer if, you know, if you do it independently, then you earn, you know, you earn a reinforcer, but I'm otherwise going to support you to do it. There's actually a parallel to that and what Antonio said about screens, which is where we have trouble is when we kind of cross our fingers and hope the child will self-manage, right? My favorite is like parents who say, I go to bed and then I wake up in the middle of the night and my kid is on screens at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? And the expectation was the kid would know to turn it off and go to bed. Or in this case, the child, you know, who is demonstrating they are having difficulties, the expectation that they'll somehow kind of kick into gear and start using the toilet. And there are just times where, as much as we would like our kids to have ownership of the self-management, the reality is that they're not able to. And so, as Antonio said, we have to step in and elevate our structure and support to help get them on that path and to move away from this kind of, I say, kind of fingers crossed. I call it wishful parenting. I just wish my kid would, you know, remember to use the bathroom. We can wish that would happen, but if it's not happening in practice, that means we need to do something differently.
We're all guilty of that, which not putting, you know, paying attention and making sure that we supervise our kids and spend more time. We're all guilty of that. It will be nice if they will self-manage, but unfortunately, even though we are busy, we have our careers, we have to pay attention to our kids, and for some kids, they need a little bit more attention than others. Very good. Next question is about a situation where kids are very, very aggressive, and they're aggressive all the time. Even when walking around, they bite, scream very loudly, or they, you know, they wake up and they are aggressive. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is a really, really challenging type of scenario. You know, when I think about parents doing work around these aggressive behaviors, it gets a little more difficult, especially if they're really, you know, safety is involved. You know, I will say, I think it's important in those cases, that's where we really need, you know, our professionals, our therapists that can really support, and typically in a more intensive way, understanding why the behavior happens. So the interesting thing is the answer doesn't change around trying to understand why the behavior happens. We still want to understand in the morning, why is that hitting happening? In you know, in public, why is that aggression happening? We still use that same model of thinking about triggers, thinking or antecedents, thinking about functions. But oftentimes when it's happening at such a high frequency, it can be really, really hard for parents to try to do that problem solving on their own. And so that's where it can be really helpful to have a therapist work with them to do that work of understanding what are the antecedents, what are the consequences, what are the functions, and then support parents, again, with such a high frequency behavior, start to implement some of the prevention or consequence strategies or skill building strategies. So there's not an easy answer for that one, unfortunately, but just to say, when we're talking about safety behaviors, more intense behaviors, that's where I personally rely on, you know, are there opportunities for that parent to get more support than just that 1 hour of parent training with me?
Also, to keep in mind, when safety is an issue, you start with behavioral intervention, you increase the frequency, you see what additional support the family can get. And sometimes, unfortunately, all these interventions do not work. So we have to keep in mind that sometimes medication can be indicated, but we shouldn't start with medication. We start first with behavioral intervention, environmental manipulation, and then if they all fail, that's when you consider medication. Starting with the medication first is not ideal in these situations. Very good.
Great.
There is a follow-up question. If the first then strategy does not work because of a child insists on the preferred activity, what can the parent do? It's always a struggle.
Yeah, it's a great question. So you say first you have to do this, then So this is where I like to talk with parents about the difference between, you know, how to interpret the child's protesting. And it's really common for parents to say, I try to say, nope, you can't have that computer until you get your math done or whatever. And my child blew up. That strategy did not work. And what I like to try to reframe is that, first of all, when your child is reactive to a strategy, it's not necessarily the strategy isn't working. It's just that your child doesn't like it. Again, we can think of behavior as a form of communication. Or I'm using a timer. You know, in 5 minutes, the screen is going to go off, right? The timer goes off, the child starts screaming. And the parent says, that timer didn't work because my kid completely lost it, melted down when the timer went off. So I stopped using it. And we'll say, you know, your child is screaming in that moment because they're trying to communicate, I don't like that timer. That timer is telling me to stop something fun. I don't want to do that. And sometimes parents assume that just because the child is reacting negatively, that means it doesn't work, when really it's just that child's way of communicating, I don't like it. And so what we try to talk about is, if you can follow through in spite of your child's, you know, behaviors communicating, I'm not a fan of this, they may end up learning, because they're having to relearn or learn a new skill, that it doesn't matter if I protest, the timer still is going to signal that the transition's happening. And so I may not like it, but I can learn to live with it. That said, I would still look at, is the ask, is the first then too big, right? Because that could be another part of the explanation. I said, first do your math homework, and then you can have screens, except the math homework was a packet of 5 pages that the kid saw and was like, that's that reinforcement. I don't care what you offer me. I don't want to do this, right? So sometimes it is about making sure what we're asking the child to do first really is, you know, a reasonable first start, because that might influence, that willingness to work for what's coming next, or to do that thing. So either looking at that, or the other example was more about like when you use like a timer, for example, as a transition, like you just need, that can be the signal the child is communicating behaviorally, they don't like it. So it's either too much or I just don't like it. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. We have, I think there's several more questions, but we have time only for one question that you hopefully will be able to answer in 1 minute and or less. So biting nails. So some kids, they bite nails. Sometimes when there is a stressful situation, tests, homework, and sometimes without any apparent reason.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about these kind of behaviors, anxiety related, and how parents can help their kids?
Yeah, this is a good example where I say context matters, right? Is the child biting their nails while they're in when they're in an environment that's loud and noisy and chaotic, and you get a sense that this is an overwhelming, environment, and we're talking about an automatic function of, where anxiety is part of it, the biting is reducing the anxiety. Or is this a kid who is just watching cartoons and is just picking at the skin or biting the nails? There's nothing, so context matters to understand. And we use a similar process where we understand, where the highest risk times, and are there ways we can modify the environment, for example, if a child bites, I had a kid who picked his fingers when he was watching cartoons. Perfectly happy. It was just kind of like a little bit of an automatic sensory behavior that he was doing. And so we made sure his hands were busy. Anytime he watched cartoons, we gave him something in his hands. If he's playing with something else, like a Play-Doh, then he can't be biting his, or picking at his fingers. But I would just say context matters. If you understand what's contributing to it, that opens the door to thinking about what I could change to potentially reduce the likelihood that the child feels the need to engage in that particular behavior.
Very good, very good. Thank you. I apologize. We have more questions, but we're running out of time. There is a question about anxiety. There will be another webinar about anxiety later on this year. And I want to, at this time, thank Dr. Beers for the great presentation and the videos. And I want to thank everyone for participating. Please fill out the survey to provide feedback and suggestions about future webinars. Thank you, everyone. Again, Dr. Beers, thank you. It's been a pleasure, interacting with you. Very good.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.